Welcome to the BPM 360 podcast. I'm Russell.
And I'm Caspar. And together we will help you navigate the treacherous waters of the BPM adoption journey. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of the BPM 360 podcast. I'm here today. Russell, of course. How are you, my friend?
I'm fine. Normally I say fine or it's great or awesome, but I thought maybe depending on the day we do a recording, I adapt that a bit. So if it was like Mondays, I would say magnificent. Tuesday, I could say tremendous, but it's Wednesday today. And I say, what would I say on a Wednesday? And then I remembered it's wunderbar. I am wunderbar today. Don't know if you know that word. It's a great German word.
Wonderful.
I like using. Yeah, it's like wonderful. So I'm wonderful.
Wonderful
today.
Wednesday.
Yeah, it's wonderful Wednesday. As you know, I'm traveling, so I'm still waking up. But I'm really happy and that we managed to get this show organized. Especially as I was reading up on our guest a bit, and I was thinking, wow, this is going to be a very special talk we're going to have today. I think.
Yeah. So let me just introduce. Well, at least by name, we're gonna ask our guest to introduce himself, obviously. But we have nobody less than Mark McGregor on the show today. Mark, welcome.
Thanks, guys, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you both, and I'm really looking forward to some interesting conversations.
Oh, I'm sure we will. And Mark, obviously, we've crossed paths numerous times by now on LinkedIn, so I thought it was not more than justified to just ask you to come on the show, and instead of having this lag between me typing and you typing and Russell typing, why not have a real conversation on a number of very interesting topics around BPM and its adjacent fields. Now, I might also realize that not all of our listeners, all 10 of them, know you at the moment. It's more than 10 by now, by the way. But anyway, would you please give us a little bit of an introduction of who you are, so professionally, but a little bit personally as well? Our listeners typically like to know that.
Sure. Well, I mean, for anyone that doesn't know, this EA BPM market, or the combination of the two, is a space that I've been involved with now since the mid-90s.
Wow.
I often joke that I've worked with, for, or alongside just about any vendor that you care to think of in the space in some way, shape, or form. Most notably, starting out with Popkin Software, so Unicom as it now is, having gone through all of its various guises. But I've worked a couple of stints with Mega. I've worked with OpenText. I worked with Proforma before the OpenText stuff. Even done a few bits and pieces for Software AG over the years in the UK. Yeah. Some people may know me through the BPMG as was all those years ago when we were out there doing the training and writing. Others may know me as the analyst at Gartner that spent 3.5 years working on the Magic Quadrant in EA. So I very much jumped between EA and BPM, so very much see where the synergies and the non-synergies are. But also over the last few years worked in the process mining, process intelligence space, obviously with people like Signavio, people like Apromore, people like Abby. So I consider myself that jack of all trades, master of none.
Oh, very cool. And just on the personal side, whatever you like to share. I mean, I know that you are in the UK typically, but that's as far as my knowledge goes. So please enlighten us a little bit. What's you have any hobbies? We always like to know hobbies.
No, absolutely. Well, golf is my passion these days.
Nice.
I say these days because, as I drift off into my semi-retirement, which is where I am now. So the nice thing now, and why I love doing these calls, is that I'm not chasing revenue. I'm not chasing the next engagement. I've pretty well said, I'm pretty well out of it. I'm a dinosaur. Gen AI can do my job now. So why do you need me for? So a large part of my life is on the golf course, and I've achieved my goal for this year, which was to get my handicap down below 18. So I'm now down to a 16 handicap.
Nice.
I'm sure there's lots of people far better than that, but to have brought it down in 18 months from like 50 now when you start to 16,
that's quick.
I'm pretty happy.
That's pretty quick, I gotta say. I mean, I play golf too. My handicap is not nowhere near yours, but I don't play regularly because I'm not yet at my retirement. I'm going there in a decade or so, but then I'm going to follow the same path as you do. But I like your remark that being a dinosaur. So let me just give you a little bit of a dilemma. Would you consider yourself rather to be a velociraptor or a T-Rex?
Ooh.
So do you move swiftly between everything and hunt in packs, or are you just this ferocious animal who knows everything about the topic that we're going to talk about?
Well, I certainly would never claim to know everything about any given topic. So, whoa,
As a matter of speaking, of course.
yeah. Well, I mean, people have heard me say before, I hate the concept of experts because, an X is a
Okay.
has-been and a spurt is nothing but a drip under pressure. So be knowledgeable, but don't try and be an expert because it's not a good place
I
to
like
be.
that. I like
So
that.
I like to think that I'm pretty knowledgeable about all the different aspects, be it from the product usage, the use cases, personas, product, etc. I enjoy working with others, but I'm quite happy working as a loner and keeping
Okay.
my own counsel.
All right. Very good. Very good. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. And the first topic I would like to dive into with Russell and you, Mark, is I would love to hear your, let's say, helicopter view on let me just call it the process industry right now. And that could be anything ranging from process mining, process management, even RPA. But let's take in enterprise architecture at the same time as well. We're going to visit that later on, but how do you look at what that process industry has gone through from, let's say, the mid 90s? And I came on the labor market at the end of the 90s as well. And I've spent most of my life in the process management side, so I've seen a lot of things as well. But where do you see the process industry going to? Where are we now, and where are we going to in the next, let's say, decade or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that I say to everyone is don't listen to those that tell you that process is yesterday. Because, it doesn't matter where we are. I mean, whether we look at the industry that we've been looking at for the last, say, 25 years, or whether we go back to Deming, or whether we go right back to, to Adam. Hey, fundamentally, everyone is always thinking about how can we work better?
Yeah.
So if we need to know how do we work better, then whether we use the word process or not, what we're really saying is I need to improve my process. So when someone says, well, we're not a process-led or a process-managed organization, to the likes of you and I, what they're really saying is we don't explicitly know what we're doing. We just do it implicitly because you can't get away from it. The only discussion around process is, are you explicit or implicit?
Yeah.
If you have a working organization or a working, club, golf club, or any other thing, then there are some rules and guidance.
Mm-hmm.
There's some do's and don'ts, call it what you will. Which means there's some sort of process in place.
Yeah.
Now, you
That
either
makes
know what
sense.
it is and you actively manage it, or potentially you don't know what it is. It's random. You have a whole bunch of issues and it jumps up and bites you. So fundamentally, let's not think about whether or not process. The fact is, it ain't going to go away. And it doesn't matter whether we're looking at the current genre of tools, yesterday's genre of tools, or whether we think that Gen AI and Chat GPT is going to do a whole load of stuff for us. Okay, it's not going to run our business.
Yeah.
It may help us. So it may be another tool, another arrow in the quiver, if you like. But it's just the next incarnation. And, that one in particular, I find fascinating when we look at it in the current vogue of process intelligence, where we have certain individuals telling us that now we've got process mining, we don't need process modeling anymore, and no one's ever gained or made any money through process modeling. I mean, that, quite frankly, that's bullshit. There are lots of organizations that have successfully re-engineered, altered, built new businesses by doing traditional process modeling. Sure, there are a lot of people that have spent a lot of time building models that they never used and wasted a lot of money. Not denying that, but you know, the same thing goes with process mining. There's a lot of people that spend a lot of money mining a process and still don't know what to do with the information. So let's not confuse the value of a tooling with the value of the mindset of actually doing something useful. So I think that there's no doubt at all, we're a really exciting inflection point where, for a whole bunch of reasons, process is once again back in focus and back in the forefront. And yes, what does it mean? Well, it means there's a lot of people out there that are really confused because they're not sure what tooling, who to believe, what it can do for them, what they need to do, and how best they can do it.
Wow.
Yeah, I like that. And, ultimately, as you're saying, with the tools, it's so much promised on what they can do and the capabilities, but actually to execute and use these tools in a meaningful way, that's something where the people don't understand that it's more than just buying the tool and then, hey, presto, you get the results. So it's doing meaningful things with the tools in a bigger context that actually only really happens, makes things happen. And what I do like as well, you talk about the processes, but I think fundamentally that's a discussion you a lot of the times have with people more in the focus of enterprise architecture and the application management, where they see like, yeah, the process aren't relevant as long as you got the right applications and the right business capabilities supported by software. That's their driving point. That's the way they look at the world and everything else. And I think they're lacking just that. Okay, but then somebody's got to use these functions, and you've got to organize your whole business around utilizing the super features that you have in your application, and that's when the processes come in. So I've always really find it hard, and I understand that there's two different necessities for tools, but there should be one thinking in a company around how to actually organize yourself better and streamline business, and process is always the substantial. I'm not going to say the key point, the center point, because that maybe aggravate the people that say applications are the center point, but it definitely is a vital point that looking, whatever side you're looking at it, you have to dig into that aspect to get things right, especially in a complex world. I mean, if you have a golf club, maybe the policies are sufficient, but as soon as you have, a franchise on golf clubs, you need procedures, and that's when the processes come in.
Yeah, and I think that, most of the people that are listening to this, because they're not dinosaurs like me, and indeed you guys are so young, you won't remember a group from the 70s and 80s, an all-girl group called Bananarama.
Oh, I do know them. Trust me.
Right, and they have the perfect song for process. And the lyric is, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. That's what gets results.
Oh, that's deep.
I'm not going to sing it because, hey, this isn't appropriate. I could, but I won't. But
wow.
That, I think, just about summarizes the whole thing when we get into that. Never mind the EA, as you mentioned there, Russell. When we look at the data people who are arguing that it's all about data, data and process, two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah.
Pretty much. We either need data to process or we're going to process the data, which touches on your point, Russell, which has always made me smile when we look at the technologists and whether they look at it from an RPA or from an application, ERP type. The only thing that systems do is automate a process, right? Now, we can go one step further, which, as you know, is my pet peeve, is that systems actually can't automate a process, they automate a procedure. And if we haven't procedurized, then we're going to get the blue screen of death, because saying, well, sometimes I check with Caspar and sometimes I check with Russell is a perfectly adequate process for me as a human being. I can make the decision that says Russell is enjoying his vacation in Vermont, so I better reach out to Caspar. However, as a system engineer, that does my head in, because I now need you to go to the nth level of detail to write all of those rules so explicitly. And this is what I think really confuses the heck out of people when we look at process management as opposed to software process implementation. because we don't need that level of detail. Human beings work really well at conceptual and logical levels.
Oh yeah.
Only computers need physical models. The rest of us don't need it.
So that triggers me. And there's because I have this conversation, of course, with a lot of clients, and I typically always start by making sure that we're aligned on what process management actually is. And I start really by using the definition of BPM that has been defined by Marlon Dumas and Hayo Reyers in the book Fundamentals of BPM, which basically says business process management is the art and science of overseeing how work is performed in an organization. And then there's another sub sentence. But to me, it's about the work that you do. It's about the agreed upon way of working, which I typically use more often as a term than the term process, because somehow the term process got contaminated along the years. And then I give them a second picture that basically says, listen, every organization, so including your own, you have a strategy. And that strategy is typically translated into an operating model or maybe multiple ones. And no matter which methodology you use, whether it's Galbraith's 5-star or McKinsey 7S, there is one component about either process or a way of working. And the trick and the added value of process management is to make sure that you're aligned from the strategy top down through your operating model, through your processes, all the way down to your work instructions. And that in the work instructions, that is where you might do some automation typically. And then you end up at execution. That's the proof of the pudding for your strategy. And if you don't have that alignment, then you might as well stop doing what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great point. You know, when we talk, and I know we're going to talk around the biz design mega stuff in a little while.
Oh yeah.
But if you look at one of the things that they push on is very much strategy to execution. And one of the things that I was recently talking with Nick Reed on was saying, well, what do you mean by execution? Because you're not in the automation business. And so, oh, well, that's not. So no, and I was digging at him saying, look, I don't disagree with you that the execution of the strategy is vitally important. And that's what we need to measure on. So if we take the process piece, as you mentioned there, and we go down to the work instructions, it isn't because we want to manage the work instruction. It's that we want to measure the outcome and make sure that the outcome is delivering against the planned strategy. The rest is just the mechanisms and the means to be either consistent or to be knowledgeable, etc. And so I think that one of the challenges we all have is when we talk strategy to execution, that people get confused because execution synonymous with automation, synonymous with systems, they think, oh, it's about executing. No. It's executing on the strategy.
Yeah. Oh, I so agree. But that does segue nicely into another point, and I'm flexible like a rubber band. So I'm going to switch two topics around now in the agenda, Mark and Russell. So Russell, just to keep you awake. I mean, it's early morning for you. I know that. So you said the execution part can mean two things, because if you say execution, it could be either the actual work being performed by people on the shop floor or in the offices, or it could be the execution of your strategy, which is typically much more high level. And that's much more change management stuff. And you need to make sure that ultimately people can do their work in the most optimal way. What I've ran into, and I would almost call them the windmills of Don Quixote, where I'm Don Quixote, is that the term BPMS and BPM have been used interchangeably for a long time. And I think it's the software vendors who've been mostly debit to that, but they are not the same bloody thing. And I mean, I think your point just mentions that, Mark, and Russell, I love your view on that as well. But I sometimes just have a slide that just says BPM with a not equal sign BPMS, just to make sure that when we talk about process management, that people understand that we're not talking about the workflow management automation part of it.
Yeah, but if you think about it, Caspar, you and I are sitting here in Europe today.
Yeah.
Russell, we've interrupted his vacation. He's out there in Vermont admiring
but he's enjoying this. I can see it.
Enjoying all the trees. And, we've always, the old joke about the UK and the US, two countries split by a common language. And when I'm talking, and as you can imagine, with all of the mergers, acquisitions, and everything else going on in the space, I spend a lot of my time these days actually talking with people in the investment community. And they always scratch their heads when they say, "Oh, we want to talk about BPM." I said, "Well, what do you mean by BPM? Where are you based, and what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, in Europe, BPM for us is largely around business process management. When you talk about BPM vendors, you're largely talking about analysis and design. Let's call it analysis and design rather than just use the modeling piece." I said, "But when we look at the US, culturally, sorry guys, analysis and design is that expensive, horrible stuff that we don't really need to do. Tell us more about how we're going to execute." "Oh, wow, you've got a system that can execute?" Right.
Yeah.
We're all about automation, e.g. BPMS. So largely, I would say that in the US, when people have been historically thinking about BPM, that to your point, Caspar, they've been thinking about process execution and new automation. If you look at it, that says, whether we think Software AG, whether we think Signavio, GB Tech, iGraphics, all of those guys covering what we see as the process management space. And then someone will say, "Yeah, but we were thinking about Appian or Pega." And so, okay. And
BPMS,
so, I don't know about you, but one of the things that I frequently say is, okay, well, my best advice is that if you've got all those on your short list, some of them are in the wrong room. Because either you want to do process management or you want to do process execution.
Well, you could say, don't you need to do both? Yeah. And coming back to the one point about the execution, that's why I like to say we need to operationalize the strategy. That sometimes causes a bit less confusion about the execution, because we've had exactly the same. You're at execution, you're going to implement the system. It says, "No, we don't want to be a system integrator. We want to get you organized. You have a strategy to grow in markets. How are you going to achieve that?" And exactly there you see this different culture, that people understand things need managing, and then you need to delegate to get things implemented, or you need to get organizations to get them up and running, or even do some mergers. And other people that are just thinking about the quick execute. Let's get this done tomorrow. And I think it's fundamentally a different, management approach or philosophy around how you do your business. But ultimately, I would argue you do, of course, need both. Depending on the way you approach the market, you need less of the other one, because you have maybe a streamlined business that doesn't need so much like complex management, and you want to get into execution because you need to be faster, versus a big tanker that needs a lot of management and then can there manage the programs that they need and initiatives they need to then implement and execute. But ultimately, you need both. The problem what I see is that this confusion, exactly what you said, it's like you get a lot of marketing, you get a lot of capabilities on the tools, you get sometimes new kids on the block in organizations. They get given this task, and then they say, okay, they really do not know where to start, what they really need. And that's why a lot of these tenders you're going, what the hell? What does he want? He needs like 3 sets of different tools to do this. And it looks like he's never done anything before. So he's like maturity level 1. And now he's somehow read upon BPM and BPMS, or just a mix of everything in Google. And he's just putting out the tender there. And you realize there's a lot of confusion out there on the market. Now, the question is, Mark, from a supplier perspective, from the vendor, so the people out there selling software, maybe consulting as well, what is your advice, or what would your ideal world be? Because the one-stop shop, having everything in one platform, it's sometimes just too much. So a good example is ours, just to an extent. The wide bandwidth of capabilities in the RS platform, down to GRC and process mining. In a lot of tenders, then the people just say too complicated. And on the other hand, if you just go in with these sweet little tools that can do one or the other, just do modeling, you ultimately realize that that's going to come to an end within the next half a year, and they're going to be running out of capabilities, and they're going to be struggling. So what is your take on that? How do you see that as a market, or what would you even recommend to like the vendors of software, how to go about this and resolve this dilemma they typically stick in?
So first point I was going to say is I like your thing about operationalizing rather than executing. I love that because you're absolutely right. If we take what Caspar was saying earlier about the work instructions, those instructions, whether they be a requirements document or a manual work instruction, when we operationalize, when we execute, we might be executing parts in a packaged application like SAP. We might have the stuff that's done manually because someone's still running around a warehouse. We're not all Amazons with robots everywhere yet. So we might have someone doing that. And at the same time, we might have another particular area that makes sense to apply our. So there's a whole bunch of ways that we might execute, and if we look at it and say, if we have that logical model of the process, then actually when we look across it, there are probably 4 or 5 different pieces of automation applying in different places. So it's not a one-to-one mapping. So I like the operationalizing to try and get people to think differently and avoid the confusion. And that ties into your second question there around the vendor. The trouble is the vendors don't want the advice, Russell, because the advice is be clear and be honest. Vendors, unfortunately, I think are a big part of the problem, because if we come to them as a prospect and I go to Celonis and say, well, how are you different from Signavio? Most times the response will be something along the lines of, we do everything they do, but better. Great. Well, how does that help me as a prospect? I genuinely need to understand which is the best solution to my problem, not who shouts the loudest or just purely on pricing. Put that to one side. I genuinely believe that there are all these companies out there. You must all be slightly different. So what is it that's different about you? And I think historically in this space, be it process or architecture, vendors are scared to say, that's not our strength. Our strength is this. They haven't got the mindset. I mean, I was in sales for a long time before I got into the modeling space. And it's really crazy, but I won some really big exclusive deals as a result of saying, we don't do that, but I know someone that does. Go and try and talk to them. And saying this to some prospects over a period of time, I had no idea the level of trust that it built up.
Yeah.
And so eventually what happened was the guy said, well, listen, I really wanted to, what is it that you really do? And because I'd really love to be able to doing something with you. And we actually wound up picking up exclusive agreements. It's like, oh, just because we didn't try and pretend to be what we weren't. We didn't need $100 million pipeline that was never going to close. We were better off with a $10 million pipeline that we could close.
Yeah, of course.
So I think the vendors need to be clearer on where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are. We all have weaknesses. We all know they're there. So trying to pretend they don't exist. And I think that's really important. And at the same time, from the user perspective, it's going to sound like heresy, and my former colleagues will probably really hate me, or maybe they won't, but don't use a Gartner Magic Quadrant to influence your shortlist. Now, I can say that.
No, seriously, I was going to ask that question. This is perfect. I was going to ask that question. I said, you now, as you introduce yourself, maybe give us a real honest advice on how valuable do you think Gartner quadrants are in pre-selecting your shortlist?
So they are really valuable, but the trouble is no one reads them. They only look at the picture.
Yeah.
If you read a Magic Quadrant in any space, few things that point out. One, it reminds you that the Magic Quadrant rates vendors, not products.
Yep.
So just because you are a leader in a quadrant doesn't mean to say you have the best product. If you want to evaluate products in a given market, then you need to read the critical capabilities assessment, because the critical capabilities assessment assesses products. And what you're going to find in many markets is that quite often that small niche player or the visionary player in a Magic Quadrant is right up there scoring really highly on a certain set of use cases. So use that capability assessment and think about your use cases and use that to draw your shortlist. If you just want to assess the relative strength of a vendor in a given market, then sure, the Magic Quadrant is a really useful tool. So I'm not suggesting it's not. Yeah. It's just tiresome that everyone jumps on the I'm a leader, republishes the picture, no one reads the words, and they're actually reading the wrong report because they're trying to assess whether Signavio process intelligence is better than an Apramor for process mining. Well, the Magic Quadrant doesn't help you there. The critical capabilities assessment is what helps you. So the Magic Quadrant is valuable, but not the way that people use it.
No, that's a nice point, Mark. Just my anecdote about people buying software lately has been, before, as many years ago, I got big tenders from BASF, and they were like 30 pages written by engineers, and they knew exactly, they thought about what they wanted, they'd written down the requirements. You could start programming software by it. And it's like buying a car. You used to open up the hood, look at the motor, creep underneath, see if there's any rust there or oil, you would take a decision. Nowadays, the people just see the car from outside and buy it. Yeah, so it's like, it's the marketing, oh, that's good. The quadrant, upright, fantastic, gone, and they've bought it. So this decisive thinking about what you need, what is your use case? Do you need a race car or do you need a lorry? And then checking out what you really are being provided, not just look at it, the polished, like furnish. That's, I think, changing. And maybe because of speed or the way communication is taken up and people are just being bombarded with more and more flashy information, and people just don't take the time, as you said, to read more than 3 full sentences of a Gartner report, which could really help. But I think it's critical. It really is a point.
So I think
I like that.
I think then I would advise companies like Gartner and Forrester to just publish their findings in the form of a series of TikTok movies about 10 seconds long, and then probably they will be consumed better than people reading the report. And I see the same thing with my kids. If they want to know anything, they just go to YouTube or TikTok and find out. And which can be a good source anyway. I mean, I've been involved in my Software AG days in providing input for these Magic Quadrants to Forrester and Gartner, and it's a hell of an elaborate process. I mean, from that perspective, I can say, yeah, I buy into that. I totally like your way of putting it, Mark. And we were always looking out for the critical capability report much more than you just want to be in the leadership quadrant. That's fine, but that's all it is. And then in the critical capability report, you're trying to wipe the floor with your competitors. But that's pretty much what it is.
But here's the interesting thing: of all these leaders in various quadrants, and let's not name any quadrant in particular, how many of those leading vendors license the reprint rights to a CC? None. So I've got a question if I was a prospect that would say, well, you say you're a leader, you pay for the reprint of the Magic Quadrant, but if you're that good, why don't you pay us and give us the reprints of the critical capabilities assessment? Is there something in there about your product that you don't want me seeing?
Yeah. I think in the last year I was at Software AG, we actually did do that. We did buy that critical capability report because it positioned Software AG at that point in time quite favorably compared to competitors. The unfortunate thing, I would say, and maybe you have an idea about that, Mark, before we go to the next topic, but there is no real Magic Quadrant anymore on BPM. That was stopped somewhere in 2015, 2016, I think. It has been replaced by intelligent BPM, but that to me is much more again on the operational execution side.
Yeah, but if you think about it, there was never let's use process modeling rather than BPM just for a second.
Yeah, sure.
There was never a quadrant around process modeling tools. So you're right that there was the BPMS Magic Quadrant, and then with Jim Siner's redefinition just before he left Gartner, it went to the IBPMS. So the BPM related Magic Quadrant has always been execution oriented. There was, I'm not sure whether there was a quadrant or not going back into the mid-90s. Even I'm forgetting, maybe it's my age. There may have been one around BPR for a little while. So, at Popkin days when we were using SABPR and Irwin was out there as well, I've got a feeling that there may have been one in some early days for BPR. But other than that, the modeling aspects of BPM were always wrapped into the EA.
Yeah.
And indeed, to Russell's point, it's worth pointing out again for people. One of the challenges I had when doing the Magic Quadrant, when I was at Gartner, was this is a quadrant, like for me, like no other, where you've got apples, pears, oranges, and lemons all in the same thing. Because when I look at those vendors, they are not the same. And I'll give you the example. How can I contrast Linux and RDoc with, say, GB Tech?
Yeah.
Hang on, one's a modeling tool and one's a portfolio tool. No, hang on. So that's the other piece of that particular quadrant, which is really confusing because you're not even comparing vendors that are operating in the same market, and Forrester call it the EAMS market. So we say, well, actually, in the Gartner quadrant today, we've got EAMS and EA and all in confusing. The same space.
Yeah, and that plays more in the direction that if you do not know your explicit use cases and have the possibility to really cross-check your use cases against the capabilities of the tool, then you're lost in the quadrant, because then you are invited people to provide RFPs that just are completely not suitable for your use case. That's a waste of time for both.
So that's an interesting segue, Russell, into the topic that we were planning on going rather earlier on in this episode. If I look at what's happening in the market right now, we talked about BPM, we talked about EA. I mean, we see SAP scooping up a lot of things. Signavio first, LeanIX now, WalkMe. We see BizDesign and Mega doing a merger, and then Russell and I had a lucky guess in saying, well, Alphabet might be number 3. We did call that, and it happened to be true. We will not divulge any sources for that, but I mean, what's up in the market? I mean, it seems like, because for me, BPM and EA are complementary technologies or concepts with really, really distinct audiences.
Yeah. So,
how do you look at that?
I think there's 3 points that I'd like to cover on that.
Oh,
so let's also throw into the mix the announcement of RDoc having that relationship with you guys at Celonis.
Yeah.
Now, I've joked elsewhere that says, well, it's a bit of an announcement. So what? You've got a partnership. Doesn't say what the partnership is, who's doing what, etc.
Yeah.
However, it's a really important announcement that's slipping under the radar. And the reason that I say it's really important is when we look at the Linux Signavio merger, let's call it that. Never mind the SAP bankrolling, but look at those.
Never mind SAP in the background.
Yeah, well, they're just
they're a small company.
It's their money. It's just their money. But what it's for me says, it's really indicative of that challenge of the different types of EA. So my take, I mean, never mind the fact that I was there at Signavio and at Linux at the time when we had the original partnership, so might have a bit of an inside track on that. But fundamentally, if we think about it, Linux and RDoc are fundamentally portfolio management products.
Yeah, same with Alphabet.
Same with Alphabet. So what we can say is that if I'm Deutsche Bank, Deutsche Bahn, or any massive Signavio customer, then the bottom line is I have got thousands of processes. And I've got the in progress, to be reviewed, live ones, blah, blah, blah. I've got a massive portfolio. Now, if I'm Signavio or Celonis, how well do I support the management of those complex portfolios? And the answer is not very well.
True.
So the Linux Signavio stuff makes a lot of sense, Nothing to do with enterprise architecture, everything to do with saying, hey, we need much better portfolio management. Now, whether that's managing the portfolios in a Signavio scenario, whether it's for the migration to the S4HANA. So that's why I put the RDoc one into the mix. Well, that becomes interesting. That says, aha, so maybe Celonis are recognizing that I don't mine a single process. I need to mine lots of processes, and which means I'm going to have some kind of process catalog. I'm also going to need to time slice those, because actually we keep talking about it as if it's redo it, as opposed to saying, well, actually, I want to do it this month. Now I've done it for the next quarter. How does that compare? And run those kind of comparisons. So suddenly I need that management platform to do impact analysis, to manage the portfolios, to look at the interconnectivity and all of those things. And RDoc, Alphabet, and Linux do that really, really well. Never mind how well or not well they addressed what was perceived as an enterprise architecture market. The fact is they are brilliant product portfolio management. And so, I think it's fascinating, and that's why I'm very curious to see what happens with the RDoc piece as well. If, as you say, Alphabet is the third piece of the jigsaw, because as I say, nothing is public yet. As I joked, there's everyone knows who it is, and no one's actually saying anything. But assuming it's them, if it were, then I think that would be an interesting piece to bring into that mix, because it would allow BizDesign and Mega to address that portfolio stuff. Now, whether it's portfolio management as the Alphabets, the Linux and RDocs do, or whether that's the portfolio of applications that they're holding in or architectural assets or processes, doesn't really matter. It's a really important piece to address the management dashboard.
And I think that's also one of the reasons. I think before that RDoc Celonis partnership was announced about a year ago, the scoop up of Symbio by Celonis, I think it was the first step of that. And saying, listen, we know that we mine, but we need to have let's say, a sustainable foundation which we can embed the results of mining to make sure that we don't have to redo them time and time again. So we need to have that process management capability, which makes sense. It's easy for me to say that it makes sense because that's what I sign on for. But anyway, let's be very transparent about that.
Sure.
But we see the same thing, of course. But what I don't understand, for all the years I've worked at Software AG, we had two of the top rated products in both BPM and EA, and somehow they never managed to decide that they should be brought closer together instead of being just two separate entities. I've never understood that.
So I'm going to come on to that one, but I want to go back to Russell's earlier comment, because I think that, again,
yeah, sure.
When we look at, and you talked about the different audiences, and I think what we come back to is, and I think Forrester may have the better idea than Gartner on this, when we talk about the EAMS, the Enterprise Architecture Management System Management Platform. Because, and this talks to exactly what you've just been saying there, and you know that as an analyst, I was always lambasting Software AG for never bringing together those two products on a single repository. I'm out there, I've written it so many times. I've got the same question mark for the BizDesign Mega stuff, because to Russell's point, the future, in my opinion, will belong to the vendor that recognizes the separation of the modeling and the repository. And when they recognize that separation, it says, yes, there is a fundamental need for an underlying repository, shall we say, for, let's just say with the analysis and design assets for a moment. And I say it that way because on top of that, I might want to capture some information through mining, whether that's task mining, process mining, whatever. But I want to populate the repository. The fact that another group of people over here may want to access this information through a, shall we say, a BPM or process modeling tool for the purpose of modeling, while someone else might want to access it to do some automation, while another group might be over there doing application rationalization. Fundamentally, for me, it's about delivering different tools onto the same platform. you made the point so well,
Yeah.
Russell, and we've all fallen foul of it in the EA space when EA and BPM is great. EA tools do BPM, but as a process analyst, I have to be able to fight a whole gamut of EA functionality to get to those couple of diagrams that I want to work with.
Yeah.
You know, you get the, well, if you just turn these off and if you just ignore, well, I don't want to turn these things off and ignore them. I just don't want to see them. I want to be able to open it up and say, I'm a business analyst. The only thing I see is the things that are relevant for me as a business analyst. I don't even want to know this other language.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that's what I've thought about this all the nights. I can't sleep because it really is bugging me. Is that it cannot be so hard to define one meta model that fits all, like a digital twin meta model, where you have all the different artifacts that and the relations, the objects are like a graph, and that you then, when you do go about integrating your tool set, you start off with the repository. You replace the existing, let's say, repositories which were focused more on the one or the other use case and replace it with one common repository. API over it, and then you have your different user interfaces and capabilities that do the reporting for your portfolio management, and you do your modeling and inputs of BPM and XML files into the as an artifact in, or even a document management system. But the fundamental thing would be, and I can't imagine that it's so complicated, especially with whatever graph databases out there, is just building up one meta model, agreeing upon a meta model, and sticking it all into one repository. Cannot be that hard. And I think you would solve so many problems if you went that way. Build some API layer around it so they can all communicate with it, but use central repository. That's my take on that.
So I'm sure there are people vendor-wise that are going to be listening to the three of us and think, oh God, here we go, another bunch of frustrated product architects. Everyone knows how to build my product better than me. But Russell, I agree with you 100%. So one of the companies I worked with way back in 2002 was a company called Adaptive, which none of you may have heard of. But
No.
they worked with the Unisys repository, UREP.
Mm-hmm.
The basic premise of UREP then was, look, everyone's doing data warehousing and data lakes. We don't want to create that single repository because it's going to be too big and overwhelming.
Okay.
The principle of UREP was say, I just need to be an access layer. So you create that, shall we call it universal meta model?
Yep.
Based on where everything is, and you go and query that meta model. The fact you then go and grab some of that data from an Oracle database over here and a SQL data, doesn't matter. The data can stay where it is. It doesn't need to persist the data. It just needs to have that meta data access layer so that to the users and to the tools, it just looks like a unified layer. Now,
yep.
The key issue, and I have this challenge and you guys have seen it as well, is that in the tool space, everyone thinks they can do a meta model. Meta modeling is a ridiculously difficult skill. And in my opinion, and I think that Mark at Biz Design is pretty good on this, but there are only two. If someone says to me, hey, I wanted to create a really complex meta model, who should I go to? There is only Pete Rivet, formerly of Adaptive, who's still out there doing meta modeling, and Antoine Longeon at Mega, that spring to mind as people say, haha, these people are working at that conceptual level and are capable of recognizing that one of those is really just one of those by another name. Everybody else is just building extensions into their meta model and just adding a field on here and adding a field on there and just making the problem worse, because no one's willing to say, well, that's really just one of those. We get into that, is a process and procedure the same thing? Well, I don't know. It depends on how you're looking at it. But fundamentally, there's more commonality. But people are not willing to do those things. And I think that someone was playing an old Steve Jobs video in LinkedIn. And, there's many of the Steve speeches. And I'm going to totally mangle what he was saying. But I loved it because it really is true for what I talk about when I'm talking to vendors in this space. And it's our job to do the really difficult things to make it look easy for the people we're selling to.
Yeah.
But we don't. If you think about this industry, very few vendors have been willing to tackle the really difficult questions, because they say, well, that's too hard, that's too difficult. Well, guess what? That's why you're not making any money. Because if you tackle the difficult problem, the chances are you'll be delivering better value to an end business. But when you keep pushing the work back onto the customer, you're minimizing the value and your value to them.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. We're trying to locate that little video of Steve Jobs, and we'll add it into the show notes, Mark, to make sure that we have the right version of words as well.
Yeah.
Now, as
everybody gets to understand how much you've mangled that up.
No,
I don't mind.
We just want to make sure that people have the original as well. Now, I have a role on this podcast, Mark, which is the timekeeper, and I need to keep time because we ran through the time, actually, to be very honest. So we're gonna, as much as I would like to continue talking, because it feels almost like a therapeutic session in some sense. Any final thoughts, Russell, that you want to share, or a last question that you have? A short one, I might add, because you like long questions.
Well, my most important question is, Mark, when can we meet up again? Because I think we've just started getting rolling, and I have so many questions around just that topic we started getting into. What is the way forward for vendors on how they can provide? And I mentioned it earlier in that question. This balance between all these capabilities, but still giving customers guidance on how to proceed in this complex environment. You talking about, say, the Celonis with scooping up Symbio and now getting a portfolio management. They all see the necessity on the market to offer customers a wide range of capabilities. But how do you make that work? If it doesn't help by having three different user managements, three different repositories, three different tools, but saying we've got everything. That can't work for customer experience. So what is the way forward and the advice there? That's something I think that's something we could dig into even more, I'm quite sure. But a lot of the points coming up to this question we discussed were just awesome. It really was insightful. But I seriously think we could take this up at some time. Maybe if some other crazy event happens on the market, that we take this up to rediscuss and dig deeper into this. Where should vendors go in order to offer this customer experience and customer excellence that they're looking for? And let's see how and if we manage to get that organized. I'd love to do that.
I would say I'd flip it around and say, actually, the next one that we do, we should turn it around.
Okay.
Because the best way to answer that question for vendors is to say, let's stop thinking about it. Let's now talk about us as users, as prospects. What is it that we're looking for that we can't find? What's limiting our ability to spend money in this space? Because fundamentally, these vendors in any of the markets, whether we look process intelligence, whether we look EA, they ain't moving the needle in terms of becoming, multi-billion-dollar revenue companies, never mind their valuations. So there must be something that they're not doing that we as potential prospects or as customers get frustrated by, that they're not delivering. So I think that if I were us, I'd approach it that way rather than the other way around. So we can talk about things like creation versus consumption and what's stopping us moving forward. What's limiting? Why aren't we using it enterprise wide? Why are we still just using a few seats here or a few seats there? What is it that stops us moving forward?
So in other words, Mark, if you're willing and able to put up with us a little bit longer in another session, we would love to do that. So the invitation is right here and right now on the table. We'll make sure it happens.
Anytime.
It was absolutely wonderful, Mark. Thank you very much for your time and your insights and your wisdom. And to the listeners and our audience, I would like to say thank you for sticking with us, and catch you next time. Cheers.
Take care.